In the last section, we talked all about variables and types and how you can store data in these variables for use later on. In this section of the course, we're going to talk all about functions and scoping so you can learn not only how to store variables and data for later, but now using functions, how to store logic to be used later in your code. So let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. And to get started, I have the same setup I had in the last section. I have an index.html file with a script with a source linking to our script.js inside the head here of our index.html, and then this empty script.js file. And if we just right click on our index.html, click open with live server, that'll allow us to open up our web page with live server, which is completely blank. And if we right click here, go all the way down to inspect, we click on inspect. Now we can go over to console, and this is where all of the output from our program is going to go. So let's just minimize this, and let's just get this moved over to the side, and we're going to get this moved over to that side. That way we have our console on the right, and we have our code on the left. So like I said, functions allow us to encapsulate logic, which we can reuse later in our code. So let's say, for example, we have some code where we're just saying console.log, and we're just logging out hi. And then let's say, we have a comment, we do some code, we have a bunch of code doing a bunch of different things, and then later on down here, we want to have another console.log where we say hi. Well, okay, we logged out hi here, we logged out hi here, we logged it out twice, but we wrote this code twice, this console.log hi. And let's say that we want to change this to actually say hello. Well, now we need to remember we needed to change hello here, and we also have to change the hello down here. So we essentially have duplicated code where we're doing the exact same thing, and every single time we change it once, we want to change it everywhere. So we have logic, which is duplicated, and we want to be able to share it everywhere. This is where a function comes in, because we could write a function that does this for us, and then every time we need to log out hello, we just use that individual function, and we can change it in one place. So let me show you exactly how you write your very first function in JavaScript. Luckily, with JavaScript, it's fairly straightforward. We write the word function, all lowercase, no capital letters, just like this. You write the word function, and then you put a space. And now after this, you get to put the name of your function. So whatever you want to call your function, in our case, we're going to call our function say hi, because that's what it's going to do. So we write the name, and this works just like a variable name. You want the first letter here to be lowercase, and then every other word is going to have a capital letter as the first letter, and then lowercase after that. And you kind of can think about this as a variable, because if we did a variable, this would say let here. But now that we're creating a function, we say function instead of the word let. And now functions, you can actually pass information to them. So what we wanted to do here is have a set of parentheses. And these parentheses are going to contain all the information we pass to our function. In our case, this function doesn't need any information at all. So we're going to leave these parentheses completely blank. Then after you're done writing those parentheses, you need to have a pair of opening and closing curly braces just like this. And generally, when you're writing JavaScript, you'll put this on a new line and you'll write all of your code inside of here for what the function does. So we used the keyword function to create our function. We gave it a name. We told it what type of information our function takes in. In our case, our function takes nothing. And then we used these curly braces to define where our function starts and where our function ends. So we can write code inside of here, such as that console.log hello. And now we have a function that does this console.log hello for us, and the name of that function is say hi. And you'll notice if we look at the output, when we save this, we don't actually have hello being printed out, because this function doesn't actually run when we create it. All it does is create a piece of logic that says, okay, now I have a piece of logic that when I call it, it is going to do this console log hello for me. So how exactly do we get that function to run? How do we make this information work? All we need to do is just take the name of our function, in our case, say hi, you write that out, and then what you do is you put two sets of parentheses. And these parentheses are where you pass information to the function. But our function doesn't take information, so we're going to leave these parentheses completely blank. Now if we save, you can see we get the text hello being printed out. And if we go back to that previous example where we had just a bunch of code here and we said hi at the beginning, and then we need to say hi at the end, you can see we get hello being printed out and hello being printed out. And now if we need to update this to say hi instead of hello, we update it in one spot, click save, and now you can see it updated everywhere because these functions are just using the logic we defined here in one place, and then it's just using that over and over again as many times as we want. Now this may seem kind of confusing at first because the syntax there's quite a lot to unpack, so I'm going to kind of go over some of the most common mistakes that you're going to run into when you write a function. Let's just come up here and we can see that we have our function say hi, we have our parentheses, and then we have our code inside of it. One thing that's really common to do is forget to have your parentheses or your curly braces here. You may forget the one at the beginning like this, and if you save, you're going to get an error. It says uncaught syntax, unexpected identifier, and it tells you exactly where that is in your code. It says script.js, which is the file we're in, and it says it's occurring on line 2. If we click on this, it'll actually bring us directly to where that problem is. You can see it saying there's a problem on line 2 of our code here. Also, if we open up our console down here with that control tilde key, we have a problems tab, and here we can say declaration or statement expected, and we click on that. It's going to bring us to an error where it says this closing curly brace doesn't actually mean anything. It doesn't know what this is supposed to do. So we can really easily go exactly to where the problems in our code are. And now these errors on their own, I mean, unexpected identifier, it really doesn't make much sense what exactly that means. But if you see something like uncaught syntax error or unexpected identifier, generally that means part of your code where you're trying to write out a function or a variable, you misconfigured something. So for example here, forgetting this opening curly brace. That's exactly what that is saying. Same thing if we forget this ending one and we click save, we're going to get another error, unexpected syntax error. And whenever you see syntax error, it just means you typed out your code incorrectly. So it's saying that you expect to have a curly brace here. And even if we go down here, it even says curly brace expected. It says we expect the closing curly brace, and we click on this, it's saying it expects it all the way down here. It's essentially saying this opening curly brace doesn't have something closing it. So we just put that there to close it off. Another thing it's really common to forget is these parentheses. And if you save that, it's just going to say syntax error, unexpected token curly brace. And in our Visual Studio Code problems, it says it expects to have a parenthesis here on this line before you get to the curly brace. So it's really important to just make sure you remember all of those different parts of your function. And with that done, you pretty much have a complete function. You can write anything you want in here. You could even make it multiple lines. You could say console.log by as well. Whoops, by. And now when we save, you can see it says hi bye and then hi bye. So you can put as much as you want inside of these functions. It's just a repeatable piece of logic you can use over and over and over again. So let me just get rid of all this real quick, and I want you to do an exercise. I essentially want you to create a function that takes absolutely no arguments, so nothing inside the parentheses, and I want it to print out your name. Whatever your name is, you can just print it out inside of that function, and then call that function and make sure that it works by checking over on the side. So pause the video now, try to do that, and then I'm going to show you exactly how to. So hopefully you pause that there. I can just come down here. Remember when we create a function, we use that function keyword, and then we pass it the name of our function. In our case, you can name it whatever you want. We're just going to say name. That'll be the name of our function. And we said it takes no arguments, which means there's nothing inside these parentheses here. We want to make sure we have the opening and closing curly brace, and then we want to print out our name. So we'll say console.log and Kyle, since that is my name. Now when I save, remember nothing gets printed out because creating a function doesn't actually run it. All it does is create the logic so we can use it later. So we can call that function say name by typing out the name, using the parentheses to say that we're calling the function. And now when we click save, you can see my name Kyle is being printed out. And if I wanted to call this function a second time, you can see that that works just fine. And if I change this here to be Kylie and save, you can see that it prints out properly. So now the next thing I want to talk about with functions are functions that actually take arguments inside of them. So let's get rid of all of this, and we're going to create a function that adds together two numbers. So we're going to say function. This is going to be that keyword. We're going to call this sum since we're summing together two numbers. We're going to put those parentheses and get our curly braces in there. So we have the body of our function here where we actually write out all of our code. We have the name of our function, that function keyword, and we want this to take two different numbers that we add together. So in order to do that, inside these parentheses, we can create two parameters. And these parameters are just names that you give to information essentially. So we want to get a number A and a number B. So we type in A here, put a comma, and we'll type in B. And this is just a comma separated list of all of the names of the information you pass into this function. And these are called parameters. Often you'll sometimes hear them called arguments as well. The words arguments and parameters are technically slightly different, but they're very interchangeable. So if I call these arguments or parameters, they're essentially the same thing. So I have two parameters being passed to this function A and B, and now I can use those parameters in the function. Think about these as variables. I created a variable named A and I created a variable named B that are only usable inside of this function. So now I have A and B, and if I want to add those together, I just say A plus B. So now I have A plus B as the sum here, and I can just log this out. So console.log A plus B. So now let's run this function. We'll say sum. We put the parentheses, and this is going to run our function, but we need to pass in A and B. So for A, since that's the first parameter here, we're going to pass in an argument. We'll say 1. Then we put a comma and a space, and now we can pass in the information for B. So we'll say 2. And now if I save this, you'll see 3 gets printed out because our first argument here that we're passing in is 1, and that goes and it sets itself as this a variable. Then our second parameter here, 2, goes and sets itself as the b variable. So we get 1 plus 2 here. And we could even create variables. So we could say let, x equal 1 and let y equal 2. And then I could just pass in x and y to this function, and we're going to get the exact same result. When I save this, you can see 3 gets printed out. If I change this to 2 and save, you can now see 4 gets printed out because we're passing in x here to sum, which is being converted to this a value, and we're passing in y here, down here, and that's getting converted over to this b value. Essentially, all that's happening with parameters is we're just giving a name to the thing we pass in as the first part of our function. And this b is just giving a name to whatever we pass in as the second parameter for this function. So it doesn't matter if we're passing in variables here, for example, x and y, or if we're just passing in, 1 and 2. This is just giving a name to whatever the first thing we pass in is, and b is just giving the name to whatever the second thing we pass in. And when I save, we're getting that 3 returned. So now what I want you to do is I want you to create a function that takes in a name. So you're going to pass it a name parameter, and then that is going to print out the name that you pass it. So here we go, create a function, a function that takes 1 argument, the name, and prints that out. A person's name. There we go. So I want you to essentially pass a person's name to a function and then print that name out inside the function. So pause the video now, give that an attempt, and then I'll show you how to do it. So in order to create this, just like what we did before, we create a function with the function keyword, and we give it a name. We're going to just call this print name. And this is going to take 1 argument, as I said, and this argument is the name that we want to print. So we can call this whatever we want. We could call A, we could call it X. I'm just going to call it name since that's a little bit more self-explanatory. We're printing out a name, so this makes sense that this is the name variable. Then we want those opening and closing curly brackets, and inside of them, we want to print out the name. So we'll say console.log, and we're going to pass in name here. Now if I save, again, nothing happens because we haven't actually run the function yet. So let's call the print name function, and I want to pass it a name. We'll just pass it my name, Kyle, click save, and now we are printing out the name we pass into this function. And if I pass it, for example, John, it is now going to print out John instead. Now I want to show you something a little bit interesting about JavaScript that is unique to it. Many other languages don't have this feature, but you notice here we have print name, and it takes 1 argument, name. What happens if we call print name, but we don't pass it anything at all? What is going to happen? Is it going to give us an error? Is it going to run? Like, what is going to happen? And if we do this and we save, you're going to notice something interesting. Everything runs, we don't get any errors, even though we should be passing a name to this. What happens is if we don't pass a parameter, in our case name here, it just defaults to undefined, and then we're printing out undefined here. It's the same thing as if we did this, where we pass undefined to print name. If we have a variable in a function here in the argument list, and we don't actually pass that when we call the function, it just sets that variable to undefined as if we had passed in the text undefined here. So you can actually call a function, even though this takes 1 argument and we give it 0, it still actually works. It'll just default this to undefined. And if we had multiple things such as name and age in here, and we did a console.log of the age here, and we passed nothing for both, you'll see it just prints undefined and undefined. If we put in the name only, so we only put in the first parameter, then the second parameter age is going to be undefined. As you can see, Kyle gets printed out, and then the second parameter age just gets left as undefined. So if you ever have a function that takes more arguments than you pass it, it'll always just default every other argument to undefined that you don't actually supply to it. Now really the last thing that you need to understand about functions is how to return values from a function. Right now every function we've created has done something, but it hasn't actually given us any return, any value that we can use. Let's go back a little ways to that sum function we created where we have sum of a and b, and inside of here we're just doing console.log a plus b. And if we come down here and call sum of 1 and 2, we're getting 3 being printed out. What happens if we want to do the sum of a and b, but we actually want to use that value for something else? Right now we're just logging it to the screen. We can't actually use this value. So instead what we want to do is return something from a function. And to do that, we just use the very self-explanatory return keyword. We type the word return, put a space, and then anything we put after return is going to be outputted from this function. So we can say a plus b. Let's get rid of this other code down here. And now if we click save, you'll notice nothing gets printed out. But this sum function is now returning a value for us that we can use. So if we create a variable, we'll call this variable s, and set it equal to the sum, now s is going to be equal to whatever this sum returns, which in our case is a plus b. And if we did a console.log down here of s and click save, you can see we get 3 being printed out because our sum is taking a and b, in our case 1 and 2, it is summing them together and returning it, so that way we can use that return value down here as the value to set to our variable s. And then we're just logging out that variable s, which gives us 3 here. If we change this to 2 and 2, you can see we get 4 being printed out. So it works very similar to what we had before, but now we can use s again. Let's say we wanted to create another variable, which is like, another sum. So we'll say sum2 is equal to the sum of 2 and s. So now we're adding 2 to s here. And if we put out sum2, we should get 4 as s, and then 4 plus 2 should give us 6. And if we save, you can see we get 6 being printed out. So we can reuse this variable that comes from our function. We can use it for other functions. We can use it wherever we want. It really doesn't matter. So now it's your turn to try this out. What I want you to do is I want you to create a function that takes a single argument name. So we'll say it takes one argument name. And then what I want you to do is I want you to concatenate 2 strings together. So I want you to take that name and add it to the string hello. So then it will return that string or that name added to the end of the string hello. So it should say hello and then the person's name. And I want you to return that from the function. Don't log that out inside the function. I want you to return it from the function and then log it out later. So set it to a variable and then log it out afterwards. So pause the video here, take your chance at creating this, and then I'm going to show you how to do it. So to get started, what you need to do, just like with all these other ones, we create a function with the function keyword. We're going to give it a name. We'll just say hi, and it's going to take in a name. So we give it name inside of the parentheses here. And then we remember we need our curly braces to create the actual definition of our function. And inside of here, we want to do a return. We don't want to have anything else. We want to return. We don't want to log inside here. So we're going to put the return keyword here. And then what we need to do is we need to take the string hello, and we just want to add our name to the end of that. So this is just going to take our name and add hello to the beginning of it. So now if I call that, I can say here, let result equals say hi, and we're just going to pass it in Kyle. Then I can console.log that result. And if I save, it says hello Kyle. And that's because our say hi is returning a variable that we set in this result variable here. And then we can log out that result variable, which just says hello Kyle. Now, a couple other little bonus things I want to mention about functions is when you do a return in the function, it immediately exits this function. So inside these curly braces, as soon as you hit return, it leaves. So if I come down here and I say console.log, this will never run, and I save, you'll even notice inside of my editor here, this kind of gets a little bit grayed out because it knows that we're never going to run this code because it comes after a return. And when I save, you'll notice this log never happens because we enter the function, we run some code, we get to this return here where it says hello plus name, and it leaves. Everything afterwards essentially does not exist because it never runs anything after you do a return. Return essentially says, take this value, return it from the function, and stop executing everything inside these curly braces. Also, something kind of interesting that you're going to notice if you were paying attention is the console.log is actually a function. This .log here, log is a function, and you'll notice that because it has these parentheses. Anytime that you have essentially a variable name and parentheses and then some arguments inside of it and then another parenthesis, that's essentially you doing a function call. So this log right here is a function, and it takes in just a parameter and it will log it out to your screen here. So we've been using a function this entire time and you haven't even realized it. That's kind of the nice thing about JavaScript is that once you learn these base building blocks of functions and variables and types, everything else in the entire language is built on these building blocks. So as long as you really understand how functions work, how variable works, and some of the other future topics we're going to talk about in this course, you understand everything about the language that there is to know, and you can build any project you want from there. Now this video is pretty long, so in the next video, we're going to be talking about a pretty special use case with functions, which is where you pass a function to another function. It's a pretty crazy thing to talk about and one of the most confusing topics, so you really need to check out the next video since it's going to clear up all the confusion for you. So I can't wait to see you in that video.